In music, a tonic is a crucial part of a chord. It is the middle note that helps anchor down the highs and lows and creates a harmony. Here at the tonic accord, our goal is to be the tonic note in the political arena. We want to bring the right and left together for a discussion. A country needs a moderate and sensible center to bring the outer extremes together. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic Accord. I'm Alex Kapitko, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Drew Nepley. Drew, how are you doing on this great Sunday?
Hello. I'm good. California is nice and pretty and hot right now. Even though we're getting into November, it was getting cold for a little bit. Then there was fires, and now we're kind of just back to normal California weather. So I'm glad for that.
Yeah, the fire sounded pretty rough the last couple of weeks. I kept getting news alerts and everything, and I'm like, boy, I feel awful for the people of California.
Yeah, thankfully they're dying down at least in Southern California right now, and the smoke has cleared, and it's nice to have some fresh air again.
Well, on to today. About 30 years ago this year, the Berlin Wall fell. And it kind of makes me think that I think it's an amazing time for us to kind of talk about the state of democracy in the world. I think after the Berlin Wall fell, a lot of people regarded democracy as kind of the winning ideology, democracy and open liberalism as kind of the paradigm going forward. You know, the end of the Cold War was basically okay, well, democracy and liberalism has seemed to triumph over socialism and leftist communism. But it's kind of interesting because the Freedom House says that since 2013, there's been 8 consecutive years in which global freedoms have declined.
Mm.
And I think it's just kind of a fascinating thing to talk about is, are we almost somewhat getting into a post-democratic world or a world that needs to see a paradigm shift in liberalism and democracy? And I think it holds true right now because I'm, as I've probably said, living in Spain right now. And today they're having their fourth general election in 4 years. And it's basically because there's just gridlock and all these parliamentary coalitions don't want to pact with each other. And basically people time and time again are having to go to the polls with really not much coming out of it. And so it's kind of interesting to me is that I think around the world we're seeing kind of a decline in open elections, a decline in liberalism. And yeah, I think it'd be fun to talk about today. What are your thoughts?
I'm super excited about this topic. I also think that, like anytime we have to give a kind of a little bit of like structural context to this. I think first off, I think it's important to differentiate between like classical liberalism as an economic structure and democracy as a political structure. They're often
Huh.
combined, but they are separate, right? They don't have to. They're not mutually exclusive. So like, liberalism and open markets and the ability to have free flowing capital. I think in the last 100 years, we've seen it as the most powerful economic driving force. Like you said, socialist regimes and communist regimes, they would get some amount of power, but then they would eventually crumble and fall. Whereas the West and its more capitalist venture economies have become the strongest. Now, I think that we also need to talk about like being the most powerful and the strongest does not necessarily mean the most like effective way to go, like have it to form a society. So, I think for the last 100 years, liberalism, and in the last 50 years, neoliberalism has been the dominating force in the world. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's been the best for everyone. In fact, it's been pretty bad for some. For the global South, in my opinion. And then on top of that, we talk about the political structures, democracy and freedom that ties into this economic stuff. I think that's been dwindling. I think that the democratic side of the world has been struggling, and I even think that unfettered neoliberalism might actually harm democracies and might be a reason why we see a resurgence in like nationalist and populist movements around the world. So that's my thesis basically. We're gonna have to start unpacking this. But to connect it to like today's stuff, like you said, Spain is going on its fourth election in 4 years. There's been a resurgence in the populist movement in Catalan to get its own
Hmm.
state and all that drama. And I think it's just because we've seen for so long that an incredible amount of wealth being accumulated, but then it's going to the wealthy, and there's been more wealthy people. Like some people are entering that class, but I think for the vast majority of the world and as a whole, a lot of people are either stagnant or declining as far as their wealth and their freedoms and combined. And so I think we're in a weird like pre-paradigm shift where I think people are starting to realize that the establishments and the institutions that we've held dear for 100 years or more, depending on where you are, they're kind of crumbling, or they're not actually promoting good society.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to look at. It is, how is the world around us changing? And I think saying a pre-paradigm shift is a good way to put it, because I wouldn't say that we are at this giant change, at this point of no return. But I think, like, the old canary in the coal mine. I think the Trump election, the Brexit vote, these right-wing nationalist elections in Hungary and Poland, I think, are all screaming to me that there's a lot of people that have lost hope in liberal democracies, that have lost hope in going to the ballot box for change. And I think, kind of put into perspective what you were talking about, is I think the biggest issue is that democracy has worked really well in the West. The West, defined as the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany, these Western powers that have kind of had pretty much history on their side, and positive liberalism on their side. But I think, the Economist has a good point where they labeled a series of setbacks since 2000 that have kind of shed light on the decline of democracy. And I think it is an interesting way to look, is there were three events outside of the West that kind of show that maybe democracy hasn't been exported as well as people think. The first was in Russia. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin tried to turn them into a democracy, and with really no success. And then Vladimir Putin took over, and he's kind of become a postmodern czar, destroying the substance of democracy. Everyone can vote, but it's kind of become a facade because there's actually no freedom of elections in Russia. And the second one is the Iraq War. Obviously, we tried to export our version of democracy, and it did not work. And it showed a lot of people, basically, that maybe democracy doesn't work, or at least the Western view of democracy. And then the third one was during the Arab Spring in Egypt, when there was the collapse of Mubarak's regime in 2011. People hoped that democracy would spread in Egypt, but instead the Muslim Brotherhood took over. And the reason why I mention these three examples is because I think it shows is that when we think about democracy and it working everywhere, we don't seem to think that maybe some cultures have other things in place that don't really openly accept democracy like we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think especially coming from my like American centric perspective, democracy is something that I just innately value. Is like, oh, like of course I want democracy. But then the reality is, like you mentioned, like there's time and time and again we have examples where people don't find it to be the best form of government. Um, Especially when you start to get into like theocracies and fundamentalism, and democracy kind of goes against that. And also in a sense like culturalism, like multiculturalism. Like democracy is the idea that like the people decide, and there's going to be pluralities, and there's going to be alliances with people, but it'll be a bunch of different people coming together to decide something. Well, sometimes people just want their own ethnic group or their own religion to decide the things because they view the other as going against their identity. And that's in itself is anti-democratic, right? If someone's just existence is against your identity, then like it's going to be hard for democracy to thrive. Um, so that's why we see places like the Arab Spring, where these dictators who were ousted, but then it was immediately replaced with fundamentalism, because that's what people identified with. And then I also, yeah, it is important to remember that democracy is not always valued as highly as we do here in the United States. And then on top of that, we're also finding that our democracy in the United States is perhaps not as democratic as we'd like it to be. I have an article up here where is written by Tom Tuhoy, he's a philanthropist and created charities, and he's a writer. And less so what he himself says, but he references some studies. And a Princeton study in 2014 found that the majority of the American public has a quote minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. And so the study suggests that the United States is no longer a democracy, but an oligarchy. And it's found is really interesting. Now, some of that might have to do with just political participation, right? If the majority of Americans don't even participate, then of course they're going to have a near zero impact. But even those that do, it says that it's such a minuscule impact compared to special interests and other political forces that are actually driving policy change. And so, you could forgive someone for thinking that we don't live in a democracy. Even when you have populist movements able to elect someone like Trump, who's anti-establishment, very quickly special interests still fill in those voids and are able to execute their policies on government, whether or not you have a populist in office.
That's a really good point there. I think you nailed it right between the eyes. The fact that even if we are a democracy on paper, more and more are showing that we are more of an oligarchy, where it is a few institutions designed for everyone, and people are feeling like they really, no matter what, don't really have a say in what's happening. And I think you and I talked about this last week a little bit. I'm reading that book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and that was what the author Noah Harari, the Israeli historian, brought up, was that he thinks the big issue between Brexit and Trump and these illiberal populist movements that are happening, it's mainly a reason because people, especially people in the liberal West who are in the heartlands, are starting to see that something's wrong, something's different, and the future is somewhat passing them by. And Harari says in quotes, Donald Trump warned voters that the Mexicans and Chinese would take their jobs, and then they should therefore build a wall on the Mexican border. He never warned voters that algorithms would take their jobs, nor did he suggest building a firewall on the border with California. And so I think it is interesting that I think voters more and more are feeling like between technology and global institutions and corporations that people really, no matter what they vote, it's just the same. Like you can vote left or right, but the same thing's going to happen. And I think that's why Brexit and Trump were so different, is because it's kind of this battle of irrelevance. I think people are feeling irrelevant with what is happening in life. And so they see someone or some vote like Brexit that'll just tear the system down. And it's interesting because like most people who voted for Trump and Brexit didn't reject the liberal package. Like they still believe in free markets and human rights and social responsibility, but it seems like they want these ideas to stop at the border. They don't want this to be some global movement. They want it to stop inside their nation's borders. And I think it just shows that people are fed up with whatever's happening. And it does bring a question is, will democracy last if the demos, the people, stop being involved?
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing too is democracy, because it is such like it's a majority based thing. It's so vulnerable to eat itself from the inside, right? All you need is a majority to elect someone that's anti-democratic, and then there it goes, right? Prime example, Vladimir Putin. That okay, on paper it's a democracy, and he technically gets the votes for every election, but let's be real. It's anything but democratic. The guy's murdering opposing, he's murdering journalists that oppose him. So it's this unique case where democracy, because of its own, like in a general sense, because of its own makeup, is vulnerable to itself.
Right.
And I definitely think that what you said about history passing people by, I think that's very true and a very good point. I think that is the case with whether it be a farmer in the heartlands of America, or someone that someone that works in a a textile factory in India, or someone that works in a call center in Latin America, I think a ton of people are like, yeah, we're seeing progress. Like, I have a cell phone, my father didn't. I might have a small apartment, my father didn't. But when you look at the rate of change for some other people in like the elite class, it's disheartening to see. Like, I just think that a lot of people are getting fed up with inequality, um, or stagnation, and it's just
Uh-huh.
it's bubbling up into like political revolutions and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Is that, yeah, people are on paper better off than their ancestors. You're right. You have a phone, you have running water, you have Wi-Fi in your apartment building, but it's like, what is this milestone? Like, are we actually progressing, or is everyone just being covered by what we could maybe define as basic needs now? I mean, some could argue that just the fact that the technology is better is just a basic need more than progress.
Yeah, and I think it brings like I think it has to do with like liberalism and especially neoliberalism. I think classical liberalism, where it had more of it was open markets, allow for the trade of goods, but it did have the element of social responsibility
Uh-huh.
and bringing up all mankind together. Whereas neoliberalism is almost too much of a good thing, where it's unfettered capitalism and no limits on wealth has led to this inequality where, yes, sure, some people might have cell phones, but you know, for millions, their wages have not increased, and for so few, they've increased an incredible amount. Going back to some more statistics here, like specifics, the Pew Research Center said that since 1983 up until 2016, that's the parameter of this study.
Uh-huh.
Upper income families' wealth doubled to an average of 650,000 a year, whereas middle income families stayed the same, no increase in 33 years, with an average like family wealth of 98,000 a year. Middle income families represent 50% of the population of the United States, and lower income families represent 29% of the population. So combine that together, you have 79% of all Americans who are either stagnant in their wages or continue to slide downward over 4 decades. So
Yeah, that's scary.
it is scary,
That's
and it's obvious that that can only last for so long before people get really upset, and I think that's exactly what we're seeing. So, like, yes, obviously, like, it is very clear that neoliberalism has the ability to create vast amounts of wealth, but it only seems to be in at least the United States, a little over 20% of people are getting that, whereas 80% are not.
Yeah, and since we're talking about neoliberalism, I just kind of wanted to take a step back and maybe try to add a definition to what neoliberalism is for
Sure.
anyone who's trying to forget about it, maybe. But basically, neoliberalism is contemporarily used to refer to market-oriented reform policies, and a lot of these concern eliminating price controls, deregulating capital markets, lowering trade barriers, and reducing state influence in the economy. So basically, in one way or another, this is low regulations and enforcing globalization. And it's been pretty much the world order from Reagan and Margaret Thatcher on to the modern. And pretty much every president in the West, left or right, has embraced some form of neoliberal policies. And so this is off of The Economist. In 1938, the term neoliberalism was proposed, among with other terms, and it was chosen to be used to describe a certain set of economic beliefs. And this concept of neoliberalism involved the priority of the price mechanism, free enterprise, and the system of competition. Excuse me. And so it's basically been what has defined how the West deals with global economics. And I guess it's been somewhat the paradigm, even though no one really talks about neoliberalism in a just common conversation. But it has been the policies that have defined pretty much the last 50 years of trade and domestic politics and domestic economics as well.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's like an interesting point you just brought up that you kind of just said quickly was probably most people have never heard this term in the context of like global economics, but it is the paradigm for how our entire world is functioning currently, or well, the majority of it. Um, And it's just that's just a fascinating like fact that you have major paradigms that are being set up in systems that a lot of people just don't understand, and they're affecting everyone's day-to-day life. That's why it's always so important to kind of, at least spend some time to get a basic understanding of politics and political life. Because you and I studied this stuff, so obviously we're interested in it. But it's always a bummer every time I'm reminded how little sometimes people pay attention to this stuff, because it is super important and it shapes our world. And so back to the topic at hand. Yeah, and so neoliberalism, you know, hell, people even forget that, yeah, Reagan was the champion of it, but even like Jimmy Carter, people forget that Jimmy Carter deregulated the trucking industries and put down trade barriers, and he had a whole speech about how federal regulations are impeding the average man. And that was Jimmy Carter. So, neoliberalism absolutely was the paradigm for the later half of the 1900s, even with left-leaning Democrats. I think now in American politics, I think that's starting to change. I think you could easily argue Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are neoliberals. I mean,
Oh yeah.
Barack Obama with the TPP and everything, that's neoliberalism to a T. I think now you have Trump, who has trade wars. Trump obviously is a weird bag. He's like a mixed bag of pro neoliberal and anti neoliberal. But then you have a progressive wing on the Democratic side that I think it's becoming more clear. Some people are starting to reject this paradigm.
Yes, and both sides too. Because
Exactly.
I think Trump and Bernie, as different as they are, could probably both could consider themselves not pro the neoliberal order to a certain extent.
Right.
Uh,
They are paradigm shifters.
yes, completely different populaces and different goals at hand, but I think both of them recognize that something's changing.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
but like and on the neoliberalism a little bit, like I I want to talk about an interesting critique of it that I never really thought about till today when I was actually reading this article in the Guardian. But it basically puts forward a thought experiment of, imagine that you're an economist who goes into, let's say, Zimbabwe. No reason I'm saying Zimbabwe, but say you go into Zimbabwe, you work for the World Trade Organization, and you go in there and they ask you, you know nothing about our country, but tell us how you would run our economy. And this economist goes, well, economics is a science of specifics. It's about, I need to know what your industries are, what resources you have, what your population looks like. But this country's like, no, we just want you to, without any information on us, tell us a policy that will work and get us out of debt and help our economy boom. And this economist goes, well, this goes against everything I've learned in my study, but I would recommend a neoliberal policy of opening up markets, deregulation, low tariffs. And basically, the point of this argument is that neoliberalism goes against all economics. It goes against specifics, because basically, what people are doing around the world, especially these Western, trade organizations, are basically telling countries that they have no idea about their internal dynamics. Hey, you should embrace these neoliberal policies. And the problem is, there's no blueprint. There's no single blueprint that fits all these nations, but all of them are developing neoliberal policies to fit in with this trade system.
Right.
And some of these countries, just it doesn't work. They just end up with more inequality and more division. I think we're seeing that, in Chile and Lebanon and Iraq and a lot of Africa, is that, yeah, these countries have adopted the paradigm, but they probably shouldn't have.
Yeah, they're not benefiting from it as much as people had promised. Well, and you're right, like you said about specifics, right? Like if you don't have a competitive advantage in an economic system, so briefly, like that could be a valuable resource such as oil or an ability to do something that other countries can't. So another competitive advantage would be like Panama with a canal. Just for those out there that don't know what I'm talking about, if you don't have a competitive advantage, then you are engaging in a neoliberal system, then I feel like the only option then is to completely deregulate your working force and to provide cheap labor. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? So if you don't have any oil, you better cough up, basically wage slaves. And yeah, and we've seen that happen. We've seen that happen across the world with especially the textile and clothing industry. I do want to back to that thought experiment though. I feel like that can also apply to any other economic um, structure or theory, right? Like if you come into a country without any specifics, it's going to be a bad time no matter what theory you put on top. I think
Right.
you and I, we've discussed this before. Like that's exactly what's happening in Venezuela, where they're trying to do the anti paradigm, an anti neoliberal thing, where it's a very state run economy, but but they didn't realize that their system was only dependent on how much oil they could export, and now that that's not happening, the entire economy is in shambles. But it's a good point. Like no matter what economic theory you have, if you're not looking at the specifics and a good case by case basis, it's quick to go wrong.
Yeah.
So that's a good point as for these neoliberal institutions like the World Trade Organization or whatever. Yeah, it's irresponsible to assume that everyone should just promote austerity without really any regard for what the people there need specifically.
Exactly, and I think we're gonna see a lot of backlash from this. And to me, it's interesting because I think it has hit a breaking point. Because 10 years ago, you only saw anger and disenfranchisement in the southern hemisphere, in Africa and South America and Eastern Asia. But now you're starting to see that seep over into Western Europe and the United States. And to me,
Right.
that's why things are getting just much more fascinating. Uh, is because it's not just the third world that is now angry at these policies and at how these elections are working now. It's now more and more rich countries, and I think that's kind of the canary in the coal mine itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you had the yellow jacket movement in France. Obviously, we've been talking plenty of times, almost every episode, about Trump and Brexit. But yeah, these are pretty big signs that the Western world is not this unified block anymore. Um, it's cracking underneath the pressure of populism, nationalism, and some of that has to do with geopolitical forces. I mean, we've talked a little bit about just in our own conversations outside the podcast. We've talked a little bit about Russia's geopolitical strategy and how that they want to destabilize the West and to delegitimize democracy and kind of reject neoliberalism. And they've been pretty damn effective at it in the last 20 years. Um, and we even saw I even saw here that Vladimir Putin told a reporter that Western liberal values are on the decline, and he obviously is promoting that, right? I think he's trying to propagandize it and make people think that even more so than it is, but he's not necessarily wrong. That I think Western values more and more are being rejected, even within the West. And I think it's going to have. Now he wants it to happen. I don't want it to happen. I think it's going to have negative repercussions as far as democracy is concerned.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's the gray area in the world is those Russians ex-Soviet satellite states. Is because I think in the past it used to be more black and white, especially during World War II and the Cold War, was that you had democracies, liberally elected politicians, and then on the other hand you had authoritarian dictatorships where
Right.
it was so easily black and white. But now you're seeing in places like Hungary and Poland and the Czech Republic and obviously Russia, where they're almost illiberal democracies. They're not completely authoritarian dictatorships. They still, there's a facade of liberalism. There's elections, there's free speech, there's open markets. Especially in Hungary, on paper, it looks like a democracy. But when you dig deeper, you see that there is something, it's almost like the upside down from Stranger Things. It's almost like the
Mm.
upside down version of democracy, where something's been sort of tainted and flipped, but there's still somewhere in there liberalism. And that's why it's getting so gray to me, is that it's almost like, is this an evolution of democracy where some countries with a more authoritarian history are maybe more keen to embrace these? Because it's weird. South America, I think, has always had more of a anti-nationalist view, but in Eastern Europe, there's this weird liberal mix. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but
Yeah, no, I get it. Turkey's kind of like that as well. Like for a moment, Turkey was almost in the EU and has open elections, and then now it's like I don't know if you could really call Turkey a free and liberal society with under Erdogan. You know, yeah, again, I think it's one of those things where it's like democracy is so vulnerable to itself.
Yeah.
Erdogan was legitimately quote unquote elected, and now he's doing everything he can to undemocratize their institutions. Um, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things where it might also swing back the other way because of some failures like Brexit. I don't see Brexit being a good thing for the UK at all. I think I think it's going to be pretty obviously a negative impact on their economy as well as their social structure. So I wonder if that will like maybe like tell people like, oh wait, maybe this isn't the right way to go against the flows of the globalism. But then again, as far as the economic structures, neoliberalism, I think there has to be a change. It's this weird thing because I don't know, the world's like waking up to the inequalities of the neoliberal paradigm, but I think it's also being blamed on democracy as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I think you're right. Is that I mean, historically, democracy has had challenges, liberalism has had challenges, and we've kind of moved on and evolved. So I think it's like you're right. After Brexit and all this, will we learn and maybe reset our course, or is this the beginning of the new norm? And it's hard to really tell right now. I think until we actually see the ramifications of leave from the EU by the United Kingdom, it's hard to tell. But part of me is more skeptical towards us maybe resetting and getting back onto course with the way things are. Obviously, first off, neoliberalism, I think we both agree, is an outdated idea that has not helped most of the world. It helps you get rich quick, but the long-term benefits do not seem to be there. But what I'm curious about, though, is what is next, because I want to turn this kind of to technology for a minute, is because I was reading an article yesterday that was basically saying that social media and the big tech firms and machine learning are almost going to make society less and less liberal and less democratic because people are just going to have less of a involvement in the system because they just don't need to.
Right? No, you won't have bargaining power.
Exactly. And then also they don't even need to make their own decisions anymore about things as even like driving and what you're cooking and what you're going to watch. And so it's like I almost see us getting less and less open in some weird ways.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, I think with like automation and the less of a need for human workforce, I think it's going to be because back in the Gilded Era with the capitalist barons, the reaction was the unionizations of the 1920s and 30s, right? It
Right.
was workers getting their bargaining power back, and that led to a lot of like socialist based movements, even in the United States and Europe. But in the future, if those capitalist barons don't need workers, then,
Exactly.
then the bargaining power is gone. And you might have just kind of authoritarian states. And then in another weird way, I think sometimes with issues of like grave danger to the human race, like climate change, it might even require a more authoritarian state to handle something like that, or a stronger state, right? Because maybe this is more just the United States centric, but at least here, we know this is a huge issue, and we can't even agree on the facts in our government about what's happening, let alone start to think of a real solution to climate change. So I don't know. It's this weird thing where it's like some of these huge issues across the world might require stronger states and less, private enterprise dealing with it. But then again, that leads to perhaps the the loss of democracy as a whole.
That's a point really well taken. I want to get to two of the things you said. The first one, where you're talking about how an authoritarian state would be able to expedite issues better. That's actually what the New York Times guy David Wallace Wells says in his book The Uninhabitable Earth, which I recommend everyone to read. But basically, he says that climate change will probably be solved by China because Xi Jinping, it's a one party state, you know, and so overnight he can just expedite policy if he wanted to do whatever's necessary. There's no political gridlock.
Right.
And I think that that is a point well taken, is that democracy is good for discussion and for pragmatism, but for something like climate change, it's almost awful for it. Um, and so I think you're right, is that the problem is, will China do that? I'm not sure. I think they have another agenda, which is, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa and
Right.
digital surveillance and a lot of darker things than I think that, unfortunately. But you're right, and maybe that is the future, is how can we balance freedoms with also action, and maybe authoritarianism could do that. And but I'm on your second thing. I think you're also right, is that these socialist revolutions of the 20th century, you know, were to help the working people get better protections and pay and rights. But with automation, there wouldn't really be able to be a socialist or communist revolution, because you're right, there's no jobs available at that time. So, um,
It would
yeah, like
it
as
would
automation.
yeah, it would have to be like you could have like a, you know, we're getting, you know, down the rabbit hole into hypotheticals here, but like if you could technically have like a communistic um artificial intelligence based society where like robots and AI do all the hard heavy lifting, and everyone else in the country can kind of reap the benefits of it. I just don't see that actually happening. I think that
Right.
you would have to have these tech giants and basically the new robber barons. They would have to give up their power to in order for that to happen. And you know, history, you know, you don't have to be that much of a historian to realize that people don't like to give up power. So yeah,
No,
yeah.
no, they don't. They really don't. And I mean, I think this next 20 to 30 years is going to involve a lot of soul searching.
Yes.
You know, I don't. I'm not as pessimistic as some people to say that we need to panic and that things could be heading down, but I think we do need to start embracing for change. Uh, we need to start thinking outside the box and maybe realizing that what we think of as normal now is not going to be.
I think that's absolutely right, because you mentioned on it earlier when there was a clear cut black and white maybe 50 years ago where the Western countries, the West Germany, right back to the Berlin Wall, West Germany was obviously better off. The average man in West Germany was way better off than the average man in East Germany. You go to American Superstore in 1960, you can get a billion different things. You go to a superstore in communist Russia in 1960, and it's barely full. You know, so it was very black and white, and that's what people are used to. That's what like my parents and my grandparents were used to. Like, of course, the West is better, and neoliberalism is better, and communism is bad. But I'm not even, you know, now everything's so gray. I mean, communism is not even a thing really anymore. You know, communist states like China are very capitalistic, but just state run. And now it's like the waters are so gray now that I do think we have to think outside the box, and we have to get rid of our notions of good versus evil, black and white, east versus west, in order to move forward. Because yeah, it is getting convoluted out there, to say the least.
Yeah, completely. It's going to be pretty interesting going forward, you know. And I think that over the last 30 years, mainly because of this neoliberal doctrine, we've spent so much time looking outwards, you know, at other countries and our trading policies and our global ties and our, you know, regional alliances and whatnot. But I think there is a grain of truth to the Trump view and the Brexit view and a lot of these more conservative leading views right now, is that maybe we do need to start looking internally and domestically at some policies, because I think going forward, this globalist order that we've kind of established is frail at best. Uh, and the problem is I didn't mention this earlier, but it works well into what I was thinking right now, is that one of the biggest critiques of neoliberalism is that you spend so much investment overseas, is that you actually forget your infrastructure in your own country. And I mean, we've seen that in the U.S. I mean, I think they looked over our bridges and roads, and pretty much everything got a D.
Yeah,
You know,
average nationwide D rating on an infrastructure.
And so that, like, I think that's the thing, is that we're focused so much on global markets, is that things are crumbling around us, uh, and so I think there is a certain extent that we do need to think about how can we improve internally, because that is the next step, and I it kind of leads into this, but I like Andrew Yang, the guy running for the 2020 presidential election, probably not going to win, but I think he has some pioneering ideas, is because most of his agenda and policies are not at all international. They're kind of about retraining and supporting our working force at home, because I think he might be ahead of the curve, saying that there's big changes coming. And if we want to conserve a democracy and liberalism at best, then we need to start changing things internally, and he wants to do universal basic income. And that's still on, that's still out if that works or not. But I think he is addressing that we're going to have a lot of angry people with just stagnant lives, and we're going to need to invest something domestically to change that,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's fair. I do think that Andrew Yang is the one that is thinking the most outside the box. I don't know, whether, like you said, it's still, still up in the air whether or not his ideas will work very well. But I do think that Andrew Yang is the only one in Andrew Yang, and maybe a little bit of Bernie Sanders are the ones that are like trying to move out of the current paradigm, um, and recognizing that the current norm is not going to be the norm for much longer. So we'll
Right.
see. It's fascinating. I mean, but yeah, like when people hear about UBI from Andrew Yang, and they're like, oh, like wow, like there really is like a communist running for president, and it's like, dude, like this guy is a tech billionaire. Like this guy's a neoliberal capitalist as it gets. He just realizes he's seen firsthand where the faults are, and he's seen that the world's changing. So I don't know. I encourage everyone out there to like get rid of your notions of like the past, because the future is going to be way different, especially with our technological revolutions and automation.
That's a very good point. And it's true. I mean, we do need to think outside the box, because I mean, we've been inside of a very specific box for a long time, and as the world's changing, it's just not working. You're right, though. I mean, I'm curious to see how it goes. Uh, my guy Ernest Hemingway has a quote, and he says that the freewheeling, hard drinking Mike is asked how he went bankrupt, and he says two ways: gradually and then suddenly. The demise of democracy is often like that too. Uh,
Mm.
and I think that's what it's easy to look back and say, oh, the signs were there, but I think we slowly need to start thinking about how we can solve the evident issues we're facing. And James Madison, I know, talked about factions a lot in the Federalist Papers. He talked about how a lot of factions is good because it creates dialogue, and there's not a large tyranny of the majority in that case. But I would almost argue that democracies become too fractured from factions.
Well, that's exactly right. And like we're talking about how you and I are like, well, we need to think outside the box. We need to think outside the box. We need to embrace a new paradigm. And yet, I think most of American politics is still entrenched in Democrat versus Republican. So much so that it doesn't encourage people to think out the box, and it doesn't encourage people to think of a new paradigm. I think a lot of people are just entrenched in the old one, red versus blue, left versus right. Um, and I mean, we see this all the time. I mean, you and I will have discussions, and I've been called right wing by the left, and I've been called left wing by the right, and I'm like, guys, just don't stop thinking of it like that. Like, start thinking of it as just a new have an idea that's just an idea in its own, and judge something on its merit. But yeah, no, I think the factions in the United States have deeply fractured our society, and they're entrenched in people's identities, and it's going to be really tough to shake that. But I think we're going to have to try, because either we're going to shake this whole red versus blue thing in a way that's like an enlightenment. I don't think it's going to happen. That's one option. Or I think more likely things are going to get so bad that you're going to have an even more more strong populist movement than Donald Trump's. Whether it's good or bad, I don't know, but I think things are going to get really bad, and then there's going to be a populist movement in the future.
Yeah, with what you're saying about populism, I've always told people I don't think populism's good or bad. It's just a symptom of something happening at the time, you know?
Yes, yes,
And
absolutely.
I mean, I wrote my college thesis about it a few years ago when we were in that class, it was about this, and it was just like populism's populism. It's just kind of the thermometer that's placed in the water, and it takes the temperature of the water and lets you know what's happening at the time, you know? And
Yeah, it's that windsock at the airport. If the wind
exactly.
if the windsock isn't moving, then that means generically, like, for most of all, people trust institutions in the establishment. But if that windsock is flailing, then that it's populism time, because people do not trust their institutions and do not trust the establishment.
No, no, and I'm really sick of talking to some friends who just call, like, I have some British friends that'll just call Brexit voters all stupid. They're like, oh, they voted for Brexit, they're just idiots, you know? And
Hmm.
it's like, no, there's something bigger than that. Not all Trump voters are racist, and not all Brexit voters have their head in the sand. Now you can argue, I mean, there is a lack of education in the Brexit vote because a lot of people did not understand the ramifications. But that being said, is that there's something truly big changing, and I think that the Trump election, especially, is just like you said. It's the wind detector where it's going off the hook because something's off, and
Yeah.
people are feeling it.
Y-
And I think actually probably the one positive of Trump is that we are learning more about what's wrong. I think.
Yes, absolutely. I think even, we could argue forever about, is Trump good or bad for America or whatever. That's besides the point. But your point is definitely true that whether it's Brexit or Trump, the average man's anxieties and fears are very real. And perhaps they misplace the blame somewhere or not, but the fears are very real, and the world is changing. And again, that brings us back to what I said in the beginning: is I think we're at the beginning of a paradigm shift. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're fully in it, but I think the seeds are growing of a new world, a world where it's no longer the West versus East, and that democracy and neoliberalism have won out. I remember people talking about that, like when the Berlin Wall did fall, it was like the West won, right? Capitalism won out, the liberal movement won out, and they won the story. And I think that story is now, we're on a new chapter, and it's anyone's game.
That's a point well said, you know. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see because paradigms change quite frequently, you know. I mean, I think the 20th century was one of the most turbulent times in history. You know, we had just, the rise and fall of fascism, the rise and fall of these communist regimes. We had several genocides. And democracy and, I guess, open thought and discussion does survive, you know. And I think we'll be okay, but we need to learn from our mistakes and be able to recognize that things need to change. And that's something that humans are not good at. We're very flawed apes, you know.
Yeah.
But we do need to realize that we can't stick with this status quo. And I'm optimistic to think that we are going to change. You know, I am.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I'm glad you said that, because a lot of this episode, to someone who doesn't know us, sounds very doomsday like. No, no, I know. I am optimistic as well, and again, like, I can see how someone in the beginning of the last century would be very scared about where the world's going, and probably a lot of bad things are right around the corner. But then in the end, things got better after that. So maybe it's one of those always darkest before the dawn kind of things. Um, I don't know. We'll see. Um, any other last thoughts before we wrap it up?
No, not really. I mean, we could talk for hours about this,
Yeah,
but
true.
yeah. What I would say is neoliberalism needs to change. We need less factions, and yeah, we probably need to start embracing Africa and South America more. Because I think all the issues come from that push and pull factor. Like the anti-immigrant ideas, is that the economies are s-holes in a lot of these African countries, and so the people are forced to go to Europe to get jobs, and then people get sick of immigrants in these places, and it's just this cycle of, oh, the economy is awful because of these high debt neoliberal deals that we've signed with Jamaica and whatnot, and then people need to leave their country to find jobs, and it's just this cycle of then you have xenophobia at home, and it just repeats itself, and we need to get out of this cycle.
Well, if anyone, man, yeah, this stuff's heavy. Well, for anyone out there listening, if you want to share your thoughts on the current political global paradigm, is it shifting? Is it changing? Where do you see it going? Do you think democracy will survive automation or survive these populist movements? Any of your thoughts we would love to hear. Again, check us out, Facebook, Podbean, Apple Podcast, YouTube. Comments are always appreciated. And we will do our best to be up on a weekly schedule as much as we can.